Hey, first of all, I'd like to say a really big heartfelt thank you to everybody that's assisted me through Patreon, PayPal, and of course the super thanks button here on YouTube. You guys really did give this channel a shot in the arm last week. I've tried my best to personally thank everybody who's donated to this channel. I know that I've missed some people out, and that is purely down to the extraordinary number of people that pitched in to help me. The sort of messaging system on Patreon isn't the best, and I've mentioned this before. And in a lot of cases, although I know people have left me messages, it won't even give me access to those messages so that I can reply to them. I am trying, I will continue to try to get round to everybody, both on Patreon and PayPal. Thank you so much. Right, last year I made a big thing of how Royal Enfield had upgraded the levers on the Meteor 350, that they were far better quality and better finish than previous iterations. And then I got my 350 that has the same levers fitted, and I've got to say I was a little bit disappointed. Now, I've already passed comment in previous videos about the poor finishing on the two-tone chrome and paint finishes on these bikes. Back with the old classics, the Classic 500, they've got this off to a fine art. It was perfect. They've been doing it for decades, so it should be perfect. With no visible masking lines on the transition between the paint and the chrome, this is exactly how it should be. Now, at first, I thought it was just my bike. It was a sort of a Friday afternoon job. But since then, I managed to have a look at a bronze and chrome version, which had exactly the same issues. In fact, to be honest, it was worse than mine. The factory skipped an entire finishing procedure at the end of painting, and they've not removed the build-up of lacquer on the chrome, which goes beyond the pinstripe. It's what we call a masking line. Now, this should have been polished back before the actual component was finished. They've managed to do this properly on the tank of this bike, but they seem to be cutting corners with the mudguards. Now, these edges need to be polished down in a controlled manner, otherwise at some stage in the future they may cause problems with the actual paint finish itself. As you all know, I love the Royal Enfield brand and I love the way that it's progressed in recent years, but I will call them out when things aren't right, and this isn't right. Now, in my case, I'm also not particularly impressed by the finish on the levers that came with my bike. They've been heavily scratched before they've been lacquered, and it winds me up because it looks a mess. Yes, I could strip all the lacquer off and then refinish them, but to be quite honest, for me personally, it's easier just to swap the levers for something different. I was a bit hesitant about this one, but now I've done it, I'm actually very glad I did. Now, these are a Hitchcock's motorcycle product, and yes, they do look very generic. I've seen this design a million times before. Well, maybe a slight exaggeration. The point is, all levers of this design are not made equal. I've got no doubt that these levers are of Asian origin, but the problem is, levers have certain safety aspects to them. They've got to be built properly. And a lot of the cheaper versions on the market don't meet the necessary criteria. This design has been copied hundreds of times, literally hundreds of times. And although some versions of these levers may seem very attractively priced, the manufacturers have cut every corner possible to get them down to that price. These particular levers are reassuringly quite heavy, which is a sign that they have been genuinely CNC machined from a good quality billet stock. Specifically 6061 T6 grade aluminium, which is about the highest specification aluminium you'll find for components like this. I have bought versions of these in the past that were extremely lightweight, and very close inspection reveals that they've probably been sandcast and then just machined up to look like billet. These are a two-tone finish with a black anodised adjuster and a polished natural coloured lever, and the polishing has been done to a very high standard without deforming the actual design of the lever itself, which is quite difficult to achieve with aluminium. Now, the black adjusters help these levers to blend into the handlebar fittings, and they are adjustable for span via a cam system, which is operated by the adjuster lever on the top. You have a total of 6 positions, which of course means that you can adjust each lever independently to exactly match your riding requirements. Now, the eyelets that interface with the pinions that actually sort of, operate the levers have been reinforced with what looks like brass, possibly bronze, to ensure wear resistance and a long service life. Granted, you will probably find examples that look very similar to these on eBay for around £20, half the cost of these. But it's a bit of a lottery as to whether you're going to get anything approaching the same sort of quality. Right, I suppose I should take you through the fitting procedure. We'll start with the clutch side because that's the most difficult side to carry out, and then we'll finish off with the front brake lever. Before you get started, the first thing that you need to do is slacken off the adjuster on the engine mount. The clutch is cable operated and you need sufficient slack to be able to dismantle your old lever easily. As you can see here, one thing I did notice is that the cables were actually dry and there was some rust forming on the actual cable, which is a bit of a surprise because I've not even washed this bike yet. Pay attention to how it was originally set for when you sort of reset it later on, but slacken it off just about as far as it will go, and that should give you enough slack to easily remove the cable from your lever. This basically takes all the tension off the cable, so now you'll find that your lever is pretty loose. This is important because you'll be struggling forever and a day trying to A, take out the cable from your old lever when it's time to, and B, refitting it to your new lever. Now, underneath here you will find an 8mm locking nut. This needs to be removed before you can withdraw the pin. This locking nut doesn't actually hold the pin in place. The pin itself is threaded. The locking nut is simply there to make sure that it doesn't unscrew while you're riding. And once you've removed that locking nut, you can then withdraw the pin by unscrewing it with a suitable sized Allen key. It has got quite a long thread on it, so it does take a little bit of time, but carefully withdraw it, being careful of course not to drop it on the floor. And then it's time to actually take the lever off. Filming things like this is always a little bit tricky. Basically, the end of the cable has a sort of barrel on it which locks into the aperture on the actual lever so that the lever will operate it. It's just a matter of carefully teasing it out of that barrel until it releases its grip on the lever. I often find that careful use of a screwdriver or something similar is required just to coax it out through the slot. You then just have a little bit of preparatory work to do before you can actually fit the new one. Now, most of these parts are blathered in grease for smooth operation, and it's always good practice to wipe all that old grease off and reapply some fresh grease on reassembly. Just about any type of grease will do for this job. You don't have to use anything fancy. I've got a good stock of Silcoline racing grease, so that's what I use. But obviously you just use whatever you have to hand or whatever, you've got reasonably accessible to you. And basically reapply the grease wherever there was evidence that grease had previously been applied. You can then go ahead and, as you've seen here, refit the cable onto the new lever. Now, just be aware there is a tiny micro switch, or it looked like a micro switch to me, deep inside the socket of the fitting. I think it will be very difficult to damage this, but just be aware that it's there and don't get too rough while you're fitting it. And once you've got your lever in place, a good dollop of grease, and then it's time to refit what should have been a cleaned up pinion or fixing pin. Don't worry about there being excess grease all over the place. You can wipe that off when you finish this job. Engage your threads carefully because you don't want to be stripping them. It's quite a fine thread on this socket. And then screw the pin home. Now, don't over tighten it. Just screw it in until it stops. That's all that's needed. And then by replacing the locking nut on the bottom, you're ensuring that that pin can never come loose. Again, there's no need to over tighten this nut. You need free play in this lever, otherwise it's going to be potentially dangerous to use. The locking nut is purely there to stop the pin from unscrewing itself with use. Now you need to readjust the clutch adjuster to get the lever itself back within specifications. I suspect that the cable sleeves on these cables are the self-lubricating type, but it is a good idea to grease this area up, especially when you consider the rust that I found, just to protect it from the weather. You can then return the adjuster back to approximately the setting that it was originally at before you started. Now, it may be slightly different because you've fitted a new lever, and you can make the initial stages of this adjustment by hand. You don't need to use any tools. You're looking for round about 3 or 4 millimeters free play. That's the free play between the lever being at rest and you pulling the lever back until you start to feel resistance, i.e. it starts to pull the cable. It's simple trial and error really, just be methodical, adjust it a little bit at a time, keep testing it and measuring it at the lever until you get the desired slack. Then and only then you should go ahead and just lightly nip up those 2 nuts to lock it in place. And when I've reached this stage, I normally like to just squeeze as much grease as I can into the areas on the handlebar. This is the area that encounters the most wear, and it's also the area that's likely to encounter water ingress. And grease will help to protect against both of those things. Clean it up afterwards and we're ready to go over to the other side, the front brake. The brake lever is actually a much easier job. It's hydraulic, so there's no cable to contend with. The only difference that you'll find here is that the locking nut on the bottom this time is a 10mm, and the procedure for removal is exactly the same. You just don't have to mess around with a cable. Careful not to drop the pin. Right, from here on in, the procedure is very similar. Clean up any old grease and reapply new prior to fitting. Now, the design of this particular hydraulic reservoir is a little bit different from those that I'm used to. There is an external plunger, a silver thing that I'm putting the grease on there. It sticks out and it's quite vulnerable, so when refitting, or should I say fitting your new lever, be careful not to put too much stress on this part. Make sure that it's lubricated well with grease, and also make sure that the little cup on the new lever also has a generous dollop of grease on it. Now, I'm not suggesting that this configuration is unusual, it's just on the bikes that I've owned, I've never come across it before. Normally, the piston is inboard with a rubber seal over it, and then there's a protrusion on the actual lever that goes into the piston, and it's quite well protected. In this occasion, if you get too rough with this, you could possibly damage it. So just carefully jiggle everything into place, and when you've got it located properly, you can go ahead and refit the pin and lock nut. Right, so once you've cleaned up, that's pretty much the job finished. The next thing you need to do is make sure that everything's operating correctly. Check to make sure that your brake light is operating as it should. Not only that it goes on, but that it also deactivates correctly when you let go of the lever. Then take the bike off its stand and check that the brake is operating correctly. Don't just check to make sure that the brake works, check that it releases properly as well. Now, I did take this bike for a test run later on, and one thing that did really surprise me is that the front brake did seem substantially keener than it had before. These levers are a little bit shorter, so in my head it doesn't make sense, but somehow they work better ergonomically, and a lot less force seems to be required to haul the bike up. Somehow the feel and response from the front brake is a lot more positive than it was before. The next thing that you need to check with the bike on its centre stand is that the clutch is operating correctly and it's not in any way interfering with gear changes. Start the engine up and run it up and down the gearbox gently a couple of times to make sure that everything's okay. You can then take the bike out for a test run. Now, I know that these levers might seem a bit too modern for the Classic 350, although I'm sure that they'll key in very nicely for the Meteor 350, which they fit, obviously. They shouldn't really look right with the Classic 350, but somehow they just work. I rather like them. I had it in my head somehow that these were going to stick out like a sore thumb and just look so wrong. The modern aspect of them somehow seems a little bit more subtle than I was expecting, and because they're polished, I don't know, for me, they blend into the bike quite well. Now, the clutch lever, once adjusted correctly, I couldn't really tell any difference over the old clutch lever, pretty much same. But the brake lever is, for me, a huge improvement. Right, as usual, I will leave a link for these levers on Hitchcock's website in the video description down below. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so, helping to support this channel. It really does mean a lot to me. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. It's completely free and you can unsubscribe whenever you like. I am of course going to be back on Friday with another accessory for the Classic 350, so until then, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.